Hey everybody, JMac here. This week, instead of putting out a newsletter, I basically wanted to share maybe a live demonstration of some of the practices I've been talking about so far. That'll be in the field guide. Like I said in last week's newsletter, it was one of those things where I really enjoyed kind of sharing these live at a conference. And I think I'm going to have a couple videos that will accompany the field guide to kind of demonstrate this. So today, let's actually take a look at some code. So what this is, just as a little backstory, is it's a Laravel project. It's one that I was upgrading for the human services. And what those human services are, basically Laravel Shift provides automated upgrades for a Laravel application. But I also offer human services where I'll actually upgrade the app for you. And it's really nice because basically if you're a team or organization that has an old application and you don't really care about the legacy aspects, maybe you just need it running the latest version so your team can move forward, or maybe you don't have a development team, you just have this old app that you kind of paid for development on and now it's dated and maybe doesn't meet server requirements and needs to be upgraded. That's kind of how I come across these, and I get to see a lot of interesting code that's in here or in these applications. And this I thought would be a prime example to kind of go through and apply some of the practices again in a way where you can kind of see how it affects the code. So again, if you're not familiar with Laravel, don't worry. This is really more of a code focus, and I'll kind of fill in the bits and pieces that may be something that's Laravel specific. So the piece I really want to focus on, there's a lot we could look at here, and I might explore that in a future video. But the piece I really want to focus on, and what I noticed duplicated, were really these few lines. This was actually in about 40 locations of the application where they were kind of checking this dev mode, pulling a very specific configuration for that, and then kind of using that down the line. So there'll be some other things we'll address, but this is what really caught my eye. Duplication, again, is something in code that it gets labeled as bad. We're going to talk about that more in the rule of three practice. But like I said, I saw this like about 40 times. So we're well over the 3 kind of threshold that I'll talk about. And it actually accounted for a lot of code, and there was just a better way. It also is actually a little beefy for what it does. So kind of like the big blocks practice that I talked about last week. This is something else that just accounted for a lot of code that you saw over and over again. So I just wanted to do something about it as part of it. I had a little extra time at the end. So first things first, though, the formatting of this is kind of all over the place. And it is in every file, and it's something that I do automatically. And like I talked about, again, in BaseCode about the formatting. So this is PHP Storm, so I can actually hit Command Option L and just kind of get slightly better formatting that happens for me. So for example, we see the indentation obviously got picked up. We did increase a little bit in line size here. I actually have to scroll now. But some of the reasons for that was really just general spacing, but also it did pick things up like these curly braces around single line if statements, which is just part of the PSR2 standard. Laravel actually follows at a base the PSR2 standard. They do some finer details on top of it. But again, since this is a Laravel project, why not choose that one, just make it easy, automate it. I don't even have to worry about it. So again, just Command Option L or Control Option L, probably if you're on Windows. And if you don't have this, just real quick, let me back up so you can kind of see the old bit here. If you don't have an editor that does that, you can actually use PHP CodeBeautifier, which is part of PHP Code Sniffer. So for example, we can do PHP CS and then pass it a standard. I have this installed globally, but you can compose a requirement just as part of your project. So this is PSR2, and then I can say something like particularly that file. Let's just focus on it so we don't have to look at a bunch. That is the task controller, I believe. Yeah, task controller. So if we run this, it should kick out, again, all of the offending errors and warnings. So there's 28 And you'll note, though, the interesting thing is that there's this PHP CBF, which is the CodeBeautifier, and it can actually fix these automatically. So that's actually a very similar command, but instead of the code sniffer, we'll just do PHP CBF. So again, CodeBeautifier, all the same arguments. It's going to automatically fix any of these violations to the PSR2 standard. So we see that it actually fixed 28, just like it said it would. There's no remaining violations. And if we go back, we see right away that that got reconfigured pretty much exactly the way PHP Storm did it when I hit that hotkey. So I think just because I'm on this line, it got a little weird with that comment. But yeah, so that's first things first. Just format the code. Super easy. Makes it a lot easier to look at, see these indentation levels. So now we can start addressing some things like that. So while I'm going to get down to here, there's just one more thing that kind of bothers me. There's all this nesting here. Again, we talk about nesting code in BaseCode. But it just makes it a little bit hard to read. So I'm not going to go through each one of these. I think there's ways in which you could break them out. There's a lot of Yoda conditionals here where basically the null is backwards. That's kind of an older practice in PHP. Or just some devs think that way. I'm not going to change it. But again, there's things that you could clean up here. Just as a quick example though, this else is pretty much unnecessary, right? Because we see this return statement here. So just quickly, I'm going to fix that just to kind of keep this whole block of focused code from being indented, right? So I'm just going to back that up and kill this extra curly down here that I forgot. So everything should still be good. I don't see any warnings here that are coming back in the editor, so everything's fine there. But again, nice and tidy. I just come back out and I can get rid of that indentation level. So let's focus on that original piece that kind of brought me here, right? So I've done some quick cleanup, some of those early practices that I kind of talk about. But let's get back in and focus on this. So first of all, dead code. Right away, actually PHP Storm again is helping me kind of see some dead code here. There's this, initialization that we do to kind of default this dev mode, but then we assign it immediately underneath that. So this is pretty much unnecessary. If we were really worried about it having a default value, we could leverage Laravel. You can pass a second argument here, which is the default. We see, again, our editors kind of helped us out to label that. If you were worried about it, you could, but ideally a configuration option that you're pulling, especially a custom configuration option like this, is something that you're setting in your application. So that default is kind of irrelevant. Same thing down here. Again, PHP Storm's kind of helping us highlight that. There's really no reason to be setting that. So again, farther cleanup now. We're getting a little better. We've lessened a few lines. But let's talk a little bit about this dev mode now. So basically we have this configuration. We're saying, look, hey, there's a dev mode. So if dev mode's on, we want to change this domain to be a different domain. Okay, that makes sense. It's pretty sequential. We can kind of see what's happening here. The code's easy to follow, right? But this is one of those examples kind of that I talk about in big blocks where there's definitely a more native way to do this. And a lot of times I see in code, not only did the copy paste probably get these developers, these original developers, where they just kind of did it this way and then started applying it. So that's nice because it was consistent. But we kind of were subject to that original developer's line of thinking, right? It's like, okay, check for dev mode, default to the live domain, but if it's dev mode, set it back to the dev domain. And again, this is applied over and over and over in the code base. And there's just a better way to do it. So first, though, before we jump into that, let's just kind of take a look at this domains config file. It's pretty straightforward. Again, this dev mode set to false. Theoretically, in other environments, it's maybe set to true. And then, again, based on that, we see some other domains. There's also not formatting in this file, so I'm just going to hit that Command Option L to kind of clean that up. So again, we have this dev mode. Let's break that up. And then we have dev domain information. We have this services domain, which I guess points to the API. And then we have the live versions of the same thing. So again, just adding some line breaks here like I talk about in big blocks just to kind of group the code so we can separate kind of what we're looking at here. So let's go back to this task controller. All right, so what I like to do with big blocks, and I mentioned this, is I really sometimes just make a comment of what this code is doing. And this code's basically getting the environment from the configuration. And more specifically, if we kind of look at the specifics, this dev domain or this live domain seems to be what we're after, live domain and dev domain. So what is that? It seems to be the CMS domain, right? So let's just make this a little more specific. So get the CMS domain for the environment from the configuration. Okay, so that's what this code's doing now. And I like to do this comment because basically, I know these are just a few lines, but it's a good habit to have because otherwise, again, you might fall into this like kind of blinders mode or line of thinking of the existing code, right? A lot of times we look at the existing code and that becomes our box. And we won't kind of think outside the box, right? We'll kind of, oh, how can we tweak this? Oh, well, you know, I can move this inline because I don't use it anywhere else, right? And oh, maybe I could default this by first defaulting to the dev domain, and if it's not set, there's a better way, right? And we might not see that unless we break out away from this code. So given a brand new, you know, greenfield, you know, no lines of code written, like what would be the ideal scenario here, knowing kind of being in the future, right? Like having this Laravel project, maybe knowing a little bit more about Laravel, like what would you do, right? Well, you would still pull it from the configuration, right? But maybe, maybe instead we could just ideally, like, we don't have to have all this like dev mode and so forth. We just pull in this, you know, domain. We'll leave that name for now. But let's just pull in this domain, this CMS domain, right? Or even better yet, this CMS URL, right? Seems a little silly to have this domains configuration namespace, and then underneath it you just have, you know, you're repeating that word over and over and over again. So just a little cleanup there to kind of set up the API that we want. Okay, so what happens when it's dev mode now, right? Or what happens when we're in a different environment? Well, that's the whole thing. The configuration is meant to be environment specific, right? So this line of thinking, again, kind of hurt that original developer. We don't even need to go down that road. If you are in a different environment, we can actually change these based on that environment. So, for example, the proper way to do this, or I guess the more modern way to do this, would basically just be able to have that CMS URL, and we can use an environment configuration to basically pull that in, right? So we can just say something like CMS URL, and we'll go set that in our .env file. Whoops, not a semicolon, just a comma. And we can go set that. And now there's really no reason to have this dev and live, you know, dance with dev mode logic that's all in there, because we can allow the environment configuration, our .env file, to handle that logic, to really remove that logic, if you will, right? Because we can just change this per environment, which is exactly what we were kind of mimicking before. So now all of this extra code that we have really becomes obsolete. And if we didn't want to worry about setting it, or we wanted the default, again, we can pass a default value. So maybe we just default to production. I tend to like doing that because I don't want to have to worry that if I upload a wrong file or something in production, or if I forget my .env configuration temporarily, or if I'm, you know, doing some kind of interesting deploy process, I know that, you know, I'm always safe, that my code's going to run live. Some people are the opposite. Some people like to set that to dev. Either way, the point is we can throw a default in here, and it's even less work that we have to do. So all of this code now becomes obsolete. So it's just a really quick example to see, you know, backing up a step, you know, formatting the code, taking a closer look at it, trying to clean it up, you know, and sometimes abandoning, really the key piece here was kind of abandoning the logic and the processes that were used before. And we did that really simply by just, you know, kind of making a quick comment and rethinking, well, how would I do this now? Forget that old code, right? How would you do this yourself? And that's what we ended up with. So we pretty much got rid of all those extra lines of code. Again, a really small example here because it was just 4 or 5 lines, but other things were several lines because they were setting multiple things. They were also using, you know, the service domain and so forth. And there are other files that actually mimicked and actually duplicated the configuration in other pieces of code as well, beyond just this dev mode. So this accounts this one line change for 3 lines. That's a pretty good ratio, and got rid of a lot of a code throughout. So let's also get rid of this comment, but before we do, I just want to clean up some naming, right? We can be more specific here. This is the CMS URL now, right? We can even get a little more proximity. We could inline this is another option, right? So we can avoid the temp variable and just use it directly there. We get a lot more context about what's happening. This CMS URL is being used to create basically an image URL, it looks like. So it gives us a little more information about the code. So that's ideally what I would do. You could keep the domain here and just give it a better name, such as CMS URL. But I like trying to keep things close. It's a proximity rule, if you will. The closer to what it's being used for, the more context it's going to give me. So again, even though we formatted the code and kind of added some lines in doing that, we actually ended up achieving less lines here. That's not always the goal, but in this case, it turned out to be a nice little bonus. So that's basically all I'm going to focus on this week, because that's kind of all I've talked about in the newsletter so far. I'm still hoping to have that early edition out here in the next week or two, but I'll probably continue to make some of these videos as I come across code that I think is a prime example of kind of how you can use some of these practices. So if you haven't, definitely come out and sign up for the newsletter. I send them out, try to send them out weekly. I've been pretty good about that so far. But again, here in the next week or two, I might slow down on that just because I'm hoping to get this early edition released.